The whisk fell from Sophie's trembling hands and clattered against the mixing bowl, the sound echoing through the MasterChef kitchen like a gunshot. She stared down at the collapsed souffle batter, a perfect metaphor for everything she touched, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, but her words shattered the competition atmosphere like glass. My mental breakdown destroyed everyone I love. The entire studio fell silent. Gordon Ramsay, who had been mid-critique with another finalist, froze completely, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm as he processed what he'd just heard. And in that moment, 15 cameras captured the exact second when a cooking finale became something far more devastating. A confession from a 20-year-old girl who believed her struggle with mental health had torn apart every relationship that mattered. The cameras kept rolling, but this was no longer about culinary excellence or winning the ultimate prize. This was about a young chef who had been cooking with the taste of guilt in her mouth for 18 months, convinced that her depression and anxiety had cost her family everything they held dear. And what happened when that crushing responsibility finally broke her in front of millions of viewers? It started as the most anticipated finale in MasterChef history. 3 contestants remained after months of grueling challenges. Marcus, a 29-year-old line cook from Detroit, Jennifer, a 33-year-old food blogger from Austin, and Sophie Chen, just 20 years old, the youngest finalist the show had ever seen. The prize was everything a young chef could dream of: $250,000, a cookbook deal, and the title that would launch a culinary career. The kitchen gleamed under blazing studio lights, every surface polished to perfection. Gordon Ramsay stood at the center like a culinary emperor, flanked by judges Aaron and Joe, all 3 wearing expressions of barely contained excitement. This was television at its finest. 3 talented cooks battling for ultimate supremacy. But Sophie Chen, standing at her pristine workstation in chef's whites that seemed too big for her petite frame, was fighting a different battle entirely. While Marcus and Jennifer saw opportunity and glory, Sophie saw something else: the chance to prove that she could succeed at something, even though her mental health struggles had destroyed everything and everyone she'd ever cared about. What the cameras didn't capture, what the producers didn't know, what even the show's psychological evaluators had somehow missed during casting, was that Sophie had been carrying the weight of her family's destruction for 18 months. Every technique she'd mastered, every dish she'd perfected, every moment of success in this competition had been tainted by one inescapable truth. Her parents were divorced, her brother had dropped out of college, and her extended family had been torn apart, all because she'd had a mental breakdown at 18 that no one knew how to handle. For your final challenge, Gordon announced, his voice carrying across the silent kitchen, you have 3 hours to create a 3-course tasting menu that tells your culinary story. This is your chance to show us not just your skills, but your heart, your passion, everything that makes you the chef you are. 3 courses, 3 hours, millions of viewers watching, all waiting to crown America's next MasterChef. Sophie tried to focus on Gordon's words, but her mind kept drifting to a conversation from 2 years ago, in the cramped kitchen of their family's small apartment in San Francisco, when her mother had found her at 3 a.m., sitting on the floor, unable to stop crying for reasons she couldn't explain. "Sophie, sweetheart," her mother had said, kneeling beside her with hands that were already showing the strain of working double shifts to pay for therapy sessions. "We're going to get through this together." But they hadn't gotten through it together. They'd gotten through it apart, scattered to different states, different lives, different versions of themselves that could no longer coexist in the same space. "Your time starts now," the finale began, and Sophie forced herself to move. Her menu was ambitious but deeply personal: miso-glazed cod with pickled vegetables for the appetizer, representing her Asian heritage and her mother's attempts to maintain tradition during chaos; hand-pulled noodles in bone broth for the main course, inspired by the comfort food her grandmother had made during Sophie's darkest days; and for dessert, a deconstructed black sesame cake. Complex, broken apart, but somehow still beautiful. Around her, Marcus and Jennifer executed their menus with the confidence of experienced cooks. The energy was electric, competitive, focused on victory. Sophie's energy was different. She moved through her preparation with technical precision, but every technique reminded her of the cost of being here. The money she'd borrowed for culinary school while her family paid for her psychiatric care. The family dinners that had become therapy sessions. The way her brother's college dreams had been sacrificed to help cover her medical expenses. 1 hour into the finale, Sophie was falling behind. Her fish was overcooked, her noodle dough wasn't coming together properly, and her dessert components were scattered across her station like her scattered family. "Sophie!" Gordon called out during one of his rounds. "What's happening here? This doesn't look like the confident cooking that got you to the finale." Sophie looked up at Gordon, and for a moment she almost broke right there, almost explained that every dish she'd cooked in this competition felt like it was seasoned with her family's tears. "Just concentrating, chef," she managed to say. Gordon studied her face for a moment, his experienced eye catching something troubling in her expression. But the clock was ticking, and there were two other finalists to monitor. As the second hour began, Sophie attempted to salvage her main course. But as she worked, trying to execute techniques worthy of the finale, the weight of her secret was becoming unbearable. She could hear her brother's voice from their last phone call 6 months ago. "Sophie, I can't keep pretending everything's okay. Mom and Dad are getting divorced. The therapy bills, the hospital visits, the constant crisis management, it destroyed them. They can't even look at each other anymore without seeing your breakdown." That call had ended with her brother saying he was transferring to a community college because the family couldn't afford his university tuition anymore, not with all the money they'd spent trying to fix Sophie. 90 minutes remaining. Sophie tried to focus on her noodles, but her hands were shaking as the memories overwhelmed her ability to concentrate on the present moment. The breakdown had started small. Panic attacks during her senior year of high school, difficulty sleeping, a general sense that the world was closing in around her, but by the time she graduated, she couldn't get out of bed most days, couldn't shower, couldn't eat, couldn't do anything except stare at the ceiling and wonder why simply existing felt impossible. Her parents had tried everything: therapy, medication, hospitalization, when she'd become a danger to herself. They'd rearranged their entire lives around her mental health, taking turns staying home from work to monitor her, sleeping in and shifts to make sure she was safe. The financial strain had been crushing. Insurance that barely covered mental health treatment, out-of-network specialists who might have the answers, experimental therapies that could cost thousands. Her father had taken a second job. Her mother had borrowed against her retirement fund. And through it all, Sophie had watched her family slowly disintegrate under the weight of trying to save her. 1 hour remaining. Sophie's noodles were finally coming together, but emotionally, she was falling apart. Every successful technique was a reminder of what that education had cost. Not just money, her family's entire foundation. Her parents, who had been happily married for 22 years before Sophie's breakdown, had started fighting constantly about treatment options, about money, about whose fault it was that their daughter was struggling. Her brother Carlos, who had been valedictorian of his high school class, had deferred his admission to Stanford to help with family expenses and Sophie's care. The guilt was suffocating. Every day Sophie felt better was overshadowed by the knowledge that her healing was coming at the cost of everyone else's dreams. 30 minutes remaining. Sophie tried to plate her appetizer, but her hands were trembling so violently that the miso glaze looked more like abstract art than professional presentation. Around her, Marcus and Jennifer were executing flawlessly, their dishes looking like they belonged in Michelin-starred restaurants. Sophie's looked like they belonged in the trash. That's when the panic attack started. It began as familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation that had triggered her breakdown 2 years ago. But now, in the middle of the MasterChef finale, with millions of people watching, the attack felt like being buried alive. Sophie gripped the edge of her station, trying to ground herself using the techniques her therapist had taught her. But all she could see were her parents' faces during their last family dinner before the divorce was finalized. The way they couldn't look at each other, the way they couldn't look at her without seeing the daughter who had cost them everything. 15 minutes remaining. Sophie tried to finish her dessert plating, but she couldn't focus. Her black sesame components were scattered across the plate like debris from an explosion, a perfect metaphor for what she'd done to her family. As she attempted to create something beautiful from the broken pieces, the weight of 18 months of guilt and self-blame finally crushed her completely. She didn't just cry, she shattered. The kind of breakdown that comes from the deepest places of shame and responsibility, the kind that can't be contained or controlled. Sophie dropped her plating spoon and began sobbing, not the quiet tears of finale pressure, but the kind of sobs that come from the darkest places of mental illness and family destruction. 10 minutes remaining, but Sophie couldn't continue. She stood at her station, staring down at a dessert that perfectly represented her broken family, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to do anything except cry over the mess she'd made of everything. The other contestants immediately noticed the breakdown at Station 3. The kitchen, which moments before had been buzzing with finale energy, fell silent as attention focused on Sophie's obvious crisis. Gordon, who had been encouraging Marcus on his final plating, walked quickly toward Sophie's station. "Sophie," he called out, his voice gentle but urgent. "What's happening here?" Sophie tried to answer, tried to pull herself together, but the words wouldn't come. She just stood there, crying over a plate of broken dessert components, unable to explain the weight of 18 months of carrying her family's destruction on her shoulders. "Sophie, look at me," Gordon said, approaching her station. "Talk to me. What's going on?" That's when Sophie looked up at Gordon with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young and spoke the words that would stop the finale and change everything. "My mental breakdown destroyed everyone I love." The kitchen fell completely silent. Marcus's knife stopped mid-chop. Jennifer's hand froze over her plate. Even the camera operators seemed stunned into stillness. Gordon's expression shifted from confusion to deep concern as he processed what he'd just heard. "What do you mean, your breakdown destroyed everyone?" Gordon asked carefully, moving closer to her station. Sophie's response came out in a rush, like a confession that had been building pressure for months. 2 years ago, I had a severe mental health crisis," she said, her voice breaking with each word. "Depression, anxiety, panic attacks that left me unable to function. My parents spent everything they had trying to get me help." Gordon stood completely still, understanding beginning to dawn on his face. "They took second jobs, borrowed against their retirement, used my brother's college fund for my treatment," Sophie continued, the words pouring out like blood from a wound. "The stress of my illness, the financial pressure, the constant crisis management, it destroyed their marriage." The silence in the kitchen was deafening. Everyone, contestants, crew, judges, was beginning to understand the weight of what Sophie had been carrying. "They got divorced 6 months ago," Sophie whispered. "My brother had to give up Stanford and transfer to community college because there was no money left. My extended family stopped speaking to us because they couldn't handle the constant drama of my mental health." Sophie collapsed onto her knees beside her station, overwhelmed by guilt that had been consuming her from the inside for 18 months. "I tore apart a family that had been happy for 20 years, she said through her tears. "My parents can't even be in the same room anymore because I remind them of everything they lost trying to save me. My brother's dreams are gone because of my medical bills. Everyone I love is worse off because I couldn't handle being a normal teenager." Gordon stared down at this 20-year-old woman who had been competing at the highest level while carrying a burden that would crush most adults, and made a decision that would define his legacy as more than just a chef. Behind the scenes, Gordon did something unprecedented in finale history. "Stop the cameras," Gordon said quietly but firmly. "Right now." "Gordon, we're in the finale. a producer started. "I said stop the cameras," Gordon repeated, his voice carrying absolute authority. "This young woman is in crisis and she needs help, not an audience." The MasterChef kitchen went dark. For 30 minutes, what happened in that kitchen existed outside of television, outside of production, outside of everything except human compassion responding to human pain. When the cameras came back on, Gordon was sitting on the floor beside Sophie, and something fundamental had changed in the kitchen's atmosphere. "Sophie," Gordon said, his voice gentle but firm, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. You did not destroy your family." Sophie looked up at him through her tears. "But the medical bills, the stress—" "Stop," Gordon interrupted gently. "You were an 18-year-old girl with a serious medical condition. Mental illness is not a choice, and it's not a character flaw." Gordon helped Sophie to her feet and continued speaking, not just to her, but to everyone in the kitchen. "Your parents didn't sacrifice their marriage for your mental health," he said. "They sacrificed their financial stability trying to get you proper care in a country that doesn't adequately support mental health treatment. That's not your fault. That's a systemic failure." Sophie was still crying, but she was listening. "But my brother's college dreams—" "Your brother's college dreams were derailed by circumstances completely beyond your control," Gordon corrected firmly. "You didn't choose to have a mental health crisis any more than someone chooses to have cancer." Gordon turned to address the entire kitchen, including the cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're witnessing is something that happens to families across this country every day. Mental health treatment bankrupts families, destroys marriages, and forces impossible choices, not because the patient is selfish, but because our society doesn't provide adequate support." He looked back at Sophie. "Your family didn't fall apart because you were weak. It fell apart because mental illness is expensive, and love alone isn't always enough to survive the financial and emotional strain." But Gordon wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. "Sophie, when was the last time you talked to your family about how you feel responsible for their divorce?" "I can't," Sophie whispered. "Every time I try, I just start crying. They don't know how guilty I feel." Gordon began typing on his phone. "What's your brother's number?" Within minutes, Gordon had Carlos Chen on FaceTime from his dorm room in San Francisco. When he appeared on the screen, his face immediately lit up with concern when he saw Sophie crying. "Sophie, what's wrong? Are you okay?" Sophie stared at her brother's face on the phone screen, a face that looked tired but not angry, concerned but not resentful, and began crying harder. "Carlos, I'm so sorry," Sophie said. "I'm sorry I ruined your college plans. I'm sorry I destroyed Mom and Dad's marriage. I'm sorry I cost you everything." Carlos's expression grew serious but not angry, heartbroken. "Sophie, what are you talking about? You didn't ruin anything, but you had to give up Stanford because of my medical bills." "I transferred to help the family during a crisis," Carlos corrected gently. "That's what families do. And you know what? I'm thriving here. I'm getting the same education for half the cost." Carlos leaned closer to his camera. "Sophie, Mom and Dad didn't get divorced because of your mental health. They got divorced because they had different ideas about how to handle the crisis, and the stress revealed problems that were already there." The conversation that followed was watched by millions of viewers, but it wasn't meant for television. It was meant for two siblings who had survived a family crisis and needed to heal from it together. "I never blamed you for being sick," Carlos continued. "I blame the system that made us choose between your health and our financial stability. But you're my sister. I would make the same choice 1,000 times over." Sophie was sobbing, but these were different tears. Not the tears of guilt and self-blame, but tears of recognition and relief. "But I destroyed everyone's dreams." "You changed them, not destroyed them," Carlos interrupted. "Mom's back in school becoming a mental health counselor. Dad's working with a nonprofit that helps families navigate mental health crises. I'm studying psychology because watching you fight made me want to help other people do the same." When the call ended, Gordon addressed the entire kitchen one more time. Sophie, you've been cooking with guilt for 18 months, but guilt over having a medical condition, guilt over your family's response to crisis, guilt over circumstances completely beyond your control, that's not justice. That's just illness talking. That's when Gordon did something that had never happened in MasterChef history. The finale is restarting, Gordon announced. All three contestants get fresh ingredients and a new 90 minutes because Sophie Chen deserves the chance to cook with healing instead of guilt. What happened next was unlike anything in cooking competition history. Sophie returned to her station, but she was different now. The guilt was still there, but it was joined by something else, understanding. She wasn't cooking to justify her family's sacrifices anymore. She was cooking to honor their love. Her second attempt was a revelation. 3 courses that told the story not of destruction, but of resilience, of a family that had been changed by crisis but not destroyed by it. When Gordon tasted her final dessert, he closed his eyes for a long moment before speaking. "Sophie," he said, "this doesn't just taste like dessert. This tastes like healing. This tastes like someone who's finally understanding that surviving mental illness isn't a failure, it's a victory." The episode, when it aired, became more than television. It sparked national conversations about mental health, family dynamics, and the crushing financial burden of psychiatric care in America. Sophie didn't win MasterChef that night, but she won something more valuable: the understanding that mental illness doesn't make you a burden and that families who love you don't sacrifice for you, they invest in you. Today, Sophie runs a small restaurant called Second Chances that employs people in mental health recovery and provides sliding scale meals for families dealing with medical crises. Her parents, while still divorced, work together at the restaurant and have rebuilt their relationship as co-parents and friends. Above her kitchen hangs a photo from the MasterChef finale. Sophie with her family, all of them smiling, all of them proud. Below it, a simple sign: mental illness is not a choice. Love is. Because that's what Gordon Ramsay taught Sophie that night, that the best way to honor your family's love isn't to carry their sacrifices as guilt, but to transform your healing into something that helps others heal too.